Thanks. Welcome to day 2 of the Global Landscapes Forum. And thanks for coming to our session on engaging the private sector in integrated landscape management. My name is Louis Wirtz. I'm the Communications Director and the Director of Strategic Partnerships at an organization called Eco-Agriculture Partners, based in Washington, D.C. And we serve as a secretariat for a global partnership initiative called the Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature Initiative. LPFN has playing host to this session, and we've convened many of our partners up here with me to provide some insight on what is a key issue for the membership of the LPFN, particularly engaging the private sector in integrated landscape management. Just to give you some background on why that's such a key issue for us, especially here in Africa as it relates to this particular conference. In 2014, the membership of the LPFN that was working specifically in Africa got together in Nairobi, just down the street at ECRAF, for a conference called LPFN in Africa. And at that conference, we developed something called the African Landscapes Action Plan. One of the key action areas in that action plan was around business and engaging business in integrated landscape management. And so I'm just going to read the introduction to that section so that you understand where this all is coming from. Effective landscape action requires engagement with the private sector, including everyone from smallholder farmers and local entrepreneurs to national utility and telecom companies to multinational extractives and agribusiness firms. But this key player in all landscapes has been largely absent from integrated landscape management. The reasons vary: outdated models of risks and costs, problems with oversight and accountability, antipathy between local communities and corporate entities, lack of knowledge and skills to engage in multi-stakeholder governance, and an unclear business case for changing practices. We must address all of these factors to ensure businesses are active, positive contributors to integrated landscape management. So for the past 4 years, members of the partnership and contributors to the African Landscapes Action Plan have been working on all of those elements. And we'll hear a little bit about the efforts essentially that have gone on by many of the members of the partnership to address those things today during this panel. And what that means is that 4 years of effort, fortunately, we can point to some changes in that state that we described in 2014. There's increasing engagement from conveners of landscape initiatives like Solidaridad, who's on the stage with me, in reaching out to their agribusiness partners and engaging them in landscape approaches. We'll hear about why they do that and how they've been successful. We'll hear from some of their agribusiness partners about why they're engaging. And then we'll also hear from some people who are working with the financial industry to bring them into this dialogue as well. So how do we engage the financial sector, a key component of the private sector, in more directly in integrated landscape management, and make it clearer why they should be investing with companies that are engaged in it and being involved in platforms that are advancing it. Okay, so we are going to do this in a very discussion format. I'll be asking questions of my fellow panelists, and then my colleague Nancy Rapondo, who is the climate change specialist with Solidaridad East Africa, will be moderating the discussion from the audience. So we'll first take some questions from these panelists, and then we want to engage with all of you. And one key tool to engage with all of you, because I know not everyone is comfortable with the pushing the microphone and saying, especially this early in the morning, is a tool called Slido that they've been using throughout the conference. If you'd rather ask your question anonymously or just quietly from the back of the room while you're looking at your phone, you can go to slido.com. Use the code GLF Nairobi to find the event. And then our specific session is the LPFN with Eco-Agriculture session. And feel free to contribute questions throughout the panel so that you can feel like you're directly responding to something that someone has said. And then we can revisit those questions at the end when we have time to take them. And Nancy will be moderating that section. And I'm also going to leave it up to Nancy right now to do introductions of my fellow panelists. Thanks.
Welcome to our today's session on private sector engagement in the landscapes. Allow me to introduce our panelists for today. On my extreme left is Julius Rono. Julius Rono is the Programs Manager, Sustainable Landscapes, working with the Solidaridad Network and having an expansive experience working in the value chains, dairy, beef, palm oil, and has also worked extensively with the private sector in Kenya and the government. And then we also have Martin Gary. Martin Gary is the General Manager of the Coffee Management Services with over 20 years experience working in the coffee sector. Martin is the current Operations Manager and in the CMS group of companies, and his work involves working with smallholder farmers in financing. Martin will be giving us the experience working with the different private sector and coffee production in Kenya, in other landscapes in Kenya and in other countries where they are working. We also have Peter Milanga. Peter Milanga is the manager of Enduimet Community Wildlife Management Area, also a partner of Solidaridad, working in the Kilimanjaro landscapes, with over 8 years experience working on aspects of conservation around Kilimanjaro and the Amboseli area. The only lady speaker is Caroline van Linders. Caroline is the Senior Advisor, Sustainable Transitions from the Dutch Enterprise Agency. For those who have engaged with the Dutch Enterprise Agency, it's also called RVO, who is one of our major partners also at Solidaridad. Caroline brings vast experience here, over 20 years of experience in the field of sustainable development. And she advises and supports different programs on sustainable topics such as energy, food, biodiversity for the Ministry of Economic Affairs and for infrastructure and environment. But since 2014, she started engaging with the community of practice for financial institutions and natural capital. So she will be giving us some insights on how to engage financiers in management of the landscapes. On the extreme left is, it's a difficult name, but I've had to get it right. Disikala Hasithiwe, but also called Sibata. Sibata is the Deputy Executive Secretary, Gaborone Declaration for Sustainability in Africa Secretariat. Disikala is an economist and development planner. He holds an MSc in development planning from the University in Scotland and spent nearly 29.5 years working as an economist and development planner at the Ministry of Finance and Development Planning in Botswana. So I believe he'll be bringing a vast experience on how to engage policy makers and also private sector in the management of landscapes. At this juncture, allow me to take back the session to Louise, who will be engaging with the panelists before I engage with the audience. Thank you so much, and karibuni sana.
Right on. Thanks, Nancy. Julius, I wanted to start with you, so we'll have to share the mic back and forth. But I wondered if you could describe what the difference has been between your engagement with businesses in your traditional supply chain work and what it has meant to, and what the message has been to them to engage them in the landscapes program that you're now working on, Solidaridad.
Thank you so much. My name is Julius Rono, working with Solidaridad. And yes, Solidaridad, over many years, we've been known for value chain development, or if you like, you can say supply chains. And our thinking is that production in supply chains is not sustainable, and we need to make it sustainable. So over the years, we've actually worked to improve supply chains and working with markets and certifications. But recently, we have changed our strategy a little bit to focus more on landscapes, and we come from the thinking that we want to go beyond certification. And in the landscapes programs, what we do, apart from the traditional value chain approaches, is that we bring actors together. we realized that over many years when we worked as using the value chain approach, we did not touch on the aspects of degradation and the wider ecosystem factors. But these are critical factors that we need to consider. And for private sector, our thinking is that, yes, we still work with the supply chains. And we believe that a sustainable production can only be sustained when we think about the larger ecosystem. And we bring in the private sector to tell them that if we don't act on the issues of the ecosystem degradation, then the future may not be sustainable. The private sector actually that we work with are people, mostly actors who are market uptakers. They buy from our producers because we work with the smallholders, we work with market uptakers, we work with small and medium enterprises as well. So our work over the past few years have been actually bringing together the private sector, bringing together to sit with government and other CSOs, of course also considering that production happens downstream where we have smallholders and in most cases very vulnerable communities. So we bring them to engage in multi-stakeholder platforms so that we discuss the wider aspects of the landscape, but focusing on specific value chains. For example, in our current landscape program in Tanzania, the Kilimanjaro, the wider Kilimanjaro landscape, we focus on 3 commodities or value chains, that is fruits and vegetables, livestock production, and coffee production. So we have been able to bring together buyers of coffee and actors in those value chains and work together towards looking at the wider factors of ecosystem conservation. Especially the very good example is in the extensive livestock production where we focus on rangeland rehabilitation so that we increase the productivity of livestock. In coffee as well, we bring in the aspect of diversification and using shade trees so that we are also able to have a two-factor effect where we increase production substantially, but also take care of the environment. Solidaridad actually, in doing this, we also are cognizant that productivity in these regions or in these landscapes over time has been getting low or stagnating. And one of our key activities or actions is, as much as we want to improve the ecosystems, the key thing that we consider very critical is increasing the productivity. We need to put money in the pockets of farmers, because when they make money, then they are able to be they are able to actually recognize that our activities in the wider landscape approach contribute to their productivity. What we are telling the private sector also is that if you take care of the ecosystems, you are capable of improving productivity. And the private sector players, they need to source more. They need more to be more efficient. So how do we do this? We built evidence. Actually, as Solidaridad, we have done several pilots. In our global landscape, our global network, for example, we have worked in many landscapes like the Java, the Ganges landscape in India, the Chaco landscape in Argentina, and regionally we are working in the landscape of Kilimanjaro, the landscape or Mazabuka landscape in Zambia, and Virunga landscape in the DRC. So those are our major pilot projects, and what we want to do in these projects is to build evidence to demonstrate that when you take care of the ecosystem, then you are able to increase and sustain productivity.
Yeah. That's really good, and so I want to check in with Martin from Coffee Management Services about how they hear that when Solidaridad says it to them, because what we're talking about here is engaging the private sector. From the perspective of Julius, that sounds like stuff, sounds super compelling, probably to most people in this room, but I wonder how compelling it sounded to Coffee Management Services when you made that case, and what the feedback in the situation is in terms of your own experience evaluating those arguments and having private sector constraints that you had to make judgments based on when you were hearing from Julius about this.
Thank you very much. My name is Martin Gary, like was said, and in Coffee Management Services, we are a management company. We manage coffee plantations, managing about 3,000 hectares of coffee in Kenya. As well, we market about 30% of coffee in Kenya, and with that, we link with about 200,000 farmers indirectly, because we have milling facilities that do the milling of coffee. With that, also, we have demonstration plots, and we provide them with appropriate inputs. Now, with that, then we have a very direct linkage with the farmer. So when Solidaridad, they did come to us and tell us, you know, we need to partner in this and make sure that we are growing coffee sustainably, because we keep telling farmers as a company, look, you have to be environmentally sustainable, you have to be socially sustainable, and you have to be economically sustainable. Now the question becomes, how do we do that? One of the programs we've had with Solidaridad is something called Kahawa Kivulini, translation, coffee in shade. Because if you go into most of the coffee plantations we have in Kenya, they are bare, they do not have shade trees. And one of the immediate discussions we had, like I said, we are a management company, with the owners of this land, with these farms, we said, look, we have now identified appropriate trees and shade trees that we can plant on the estates. And we started off with eight of our plantations. And we were able to distribute 120,000 seedlings in these plantations, and that was in phase one, and that is complete. The second phase is to involve the cooperatives. And we put up trees, nurseries in 5 cooperatives. And with that, we had 80,000 seedlings. That's already being planted. In the third phase of that program, we have 100,000 seedlings that we are currently propagating to be disseminated across those landscapes. And to be honest, what you find is that whereas one might say that the Kenyan coffee production is stagnating at 42 to 50,000 metric tons of coffee, with the partners we've engaged in these sort of programs, actually there is a very huge increase in productivity. In one case, in a cooperative in Nembu, when we started, they were doing 400,000 kilos of cherry. Right now, they're about 2.5 million kilos of cherry. Now, that is a 5-fold, 6-fold increase. Now, that is sustainable because with that comes quality. With that comes an assured market, because even partners that deal with them in terms of the purchase of these coffees are able to know that this coffee has been grown sustainably, because they are, like Julius was mentioning before, the issue of certification even becomes more critical as well, because everybody wants to know that this coffee has been grown sustainably. Then they end up getting better premiums, better prices for their coffee, better incomes. Some of these, like this year, and have gotten about 90 cents to $1 per kilo of cherry. And that's, if you compare that with any other part of the world, this is a very, very good price for the Kenyan farmer, considering that their cost of production is perhaps 30 cents per kilo of cherry. And that is sustainable.
Could you just touch on what the difference between what you were doing before you were invited into sort of thinking more about at a landscape scale, and what you're doing now, And maybe even if you have like some sense of what the business costs of that change have been. So what does it mean really functionally for the business to operate in this slightly different way with Solidaridad?
A good question. As a policy, as a strategic policy for us, we were on the thinking already that in our strategic plan we have to be leaders in sustainably grown coffees. And therefore, we were implementers mostly and leading farmers and helping farmers to get certified in one program or another. Now, with that, you end up training a lot on good agricultural practices and best processing practices. But then the question becomes, some of these farmers who may not have the wherewithal to plant more trees, they may not have the seedlings, and therefore you come in and say, look, I have a partner that we can partner with, and we can put up a nursery, and with this you can, buy perhaps this seedling at a very subsidized price, because sometimes free things may not necessarily be very welcome, and therefore they participate, and so the approach becomes with that they learn, and they are able to see the impact because when the trees mature, when they sell the coffee better, they are able even to increase their land under production. They are able to lease more land. They are able to increase productivity. So you expand more. More people come to, even for us as a business, we get more business that way because a lot more farmers realize we have a lot more to offer than our competition, who is sometimes only maybe perhaps just saying we will sell your coffee and mill it. That's it. So you have a more value add, and therefore you have better loyalty and a more sustainable business.
Thanks. Great. So Peter, I want to turn to you, it's excellent to have you on the panel because you come from the community-led enterprise side of this, which is often overlooked when we have conversations about engaging the private sector, where we think about businesses kind of starting at the size of CMS and going up to multinationals, but there's much of the activity and much of the needed investment is at this community-led enterprise scale. And from my understanding of Endemid, you're really looking at developing those enterprises at the landscape level in the Kilimanjaro landscape. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what enterprise development looks like within your program, within WMA up there, the wildlife management area, and then what the power of landscape thinking or integrated landscape management is for that process. And then what kind of support maybe you've received from working together with Solidaridad or other partners in that enterprise development.
Thank you so much. My name's Peter Milanga from the Nduimeti Community Wildlife Management Area, which is located in Longido District in the Arusha region. Our conservation area actually is bordering the political boundary of Kenya and Tanzania within the larger Amboseli Kilimanjaro ecosystem. Basically what we do in the area, we manage the rangeland resources for our pastoral communities, who are mainly the Maasai people. And for this community, having a big number of wildlife, having a big number of livestock is more of like a prestige to them. So compared to the small size of the area, we are compelling to educate this local Maasai to find a way of increasing the product, the value of the livestock products so that we are able to coexist with the livestock that we are conserving in the area. Other thing that we do in the area, we conserve a lot of wildlife resources, mostly the elephants, we have the buffalo, lions, giraffe, just to mention a few. And more importantly, our area is where we have the remaining elephant corridor called Kitenden, which provide the connectivity between the Amboseli and the Kilimanjaro National Park. So because of the growing pressures in the landscape, especially in terms of population, this corridor has been facing a number of challenges in terms of encroachment. And so it's why we see the necessity of working with the private sector to make sure that at least the master communities can be able to focus more on improving their livestock products so that they are able to reduce the number of the cattle in the area. And by so doing, they can be able to generate some income to support their families and be also part of the conservation effort that we're bringing in the area. And to do all of these issues, we need the finances, and that's where the private sector comes. In the area, we have a lot of spaces for investment in the photographic tourism, also in hunting tourism. But in issues to do with the livestock, we also have enough space for the construction of the slaughterhouses, which is likely to be one way of actually improving the value of the livestock product in the area. But also for those who are interested in the tourism sector, there is also space for construction of the lodges and campsites. And out of that is where we can be able to generate some revenue, which we can now put back into our key conservation issues in improving the rangeland resources for the livestock community. I don't think if ever.
So I wanted to, you mentioned the level of finance, like that the business opportunities are designed to finance the community development, and then specifically a couple of potential areas for investment: tourism development and slaughterhouse development. And so, kind of on that note about where the finance comes in, I wanted to turn to Carolina and Sabata and ask about the willingness of financial institutions in Africa to get involved in these kinds of landscape management initiatives and to work with communities at that scale, and what some of the barriers are to that, and what you're working on to try to overcome some of those.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity of presenting this to be an all-male panel. And beautiful to be here. Engaging the private sector is not an easy task, as many of you know, and engaging financial institutions might even be harder. They speak a different language, especially if you talk about sustainability with a landscape approach. They are more on the short term, on direct returns, and as you all know, if you work on this landscape level approaches, you need long term, you need to have an idea of multiple returns, so it's not easy. When I was at the ALAB meeting in Addis Ababa 2 years ago, the African Landscape Action Plan. It turned out that with all the progress being made, progress on engaging the financial sector was lacking. So we came up with the idea to see if we can transform a policy instrument that we have been using in the Netherlands and in Europe on a European level, to see if we could transform it for the African context. And that concept is the concept of making a community of practice, which is kind of a learning network of financials, frontrunners, working on sustainability, learning from each other. And so the last year, I've been engaged in a study of financial institutions in Africa. Where are they working on? How is their awareness on integrated landscape management? How is their willingness to maybe participate in such a community? Can I find the budget to run such a process? And if you're interested, I can explain a little bit more about how it works in a later round of questions. But what is also very important with such a policy instrument as a community of practice is that you find a host to host such a community. And for this, we have been engaging with the Gaborone Declaration on Sustainable Africa, their secretariat, to see whether they could be the host to run such a community of practice from next year on, I hope. And of course, they know much more about the African willingness and appetite to maybe engage financials in such a process. So that's why I'm really, really happy that we are here together. I know more about the concept, but you know more about the local situation. So maybe I can turn over to you for more explanation on the appetite.
Thank you so much, Louis and Caroline. My name is Disikala Lakasitsi, which is as difficult as that. But for purpose of this discussion, just call me Sabata. Yes, perhaps at the risk of repeating what Caroline has just outlined, and admittedly there are challenges in getting the private sector, and we are looking at the financial institutions engaged and bringing them closer to the sustainability agenda. But we approach it from the perspective that says every transformative process has a starting point. And I must say on this note, we have a good starting point. And the good starting point, I will make reference to the dialogues or discussion that we have started with some of the financial institutions, some of the banks in Botswana, where the Gaborone Declaration for Sustainability in Africa is headquartered, is hosted. We have a very interesting discussion with Barclays Bank of Botswana. We had a few dialogues with them involving part of the private sector. And the interesting thing is that we found out that, in fact, most of the private sector, and particularly those who are partners to Barclays Bank, are already sensitized to issues around sustainability and also around issues on sustainable financing. Is amazing. So we have a good start, and we were also amazed to learn that most of the corporate entities are actually partners of Barclays Bank, Botswana. We do, of course, there is the problem of operating in silos. And here, one of the issues they have, one of the suggestions they have put across was that if they could be assisted to involve other financial institutions and more private sector, bring them together under one roof and get them understand the link between nature and sustainable production. That's all they want. They want to be capacitated, and this is where our partnership with the Dutch government and also other partners, strategic partners like the World Bank, through their program on valuation of wealth accounting and valuation of ecosystem services comes in. The UNEP, who we recently signed a memorandum of understanding with, which also provides splendid opportunities to come up with, among other things, mechanisms for financing projects, around the sustainable environment or landscapes space. So there is already a sound basis for action. And what is required is to work out the modalities for working together with partners like, the Dutch government here, come up with more specific programs which will help empower the financial institutions to be able to sing the song that we want them to start singing. I think maybe I should end here for now. Thank you.
Okay, so I wanted to ask Julius a question related to engaging financial institutions in particular, because I know that as you're building a landscape program, you have a lot of experience as an organization working with commodity producers and those value chain actors. But of course, the financial institutions are also value chain actors, and so if we want to. How much have you explored, or how much are you actively working with the investors, the current investors and potential investors in your sustainable landscapes work, and what's been their response? What questions do you feel like are coming up again and again with them?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, like my colleague said, financing becomes a big challenge in the landscape, because of the reason that how do companies benefit directly from it? But like we have discussed, the long-term benefits are really good. In Solidaridad's engagement, I want to say it's also an uphill task. In Kenya and Tanzania, we have involved banking institutions in some of our work in the horticulture sector and in the livestock sector and coffee sector of Tanzania. And the question that always pops up is that what is the benefit to invest in, if you talk about landscape, but if you talk about investing like in livestock or in coffee or working with farmers, then it is fine, there is a business case. But the big question is, are these producers investment ready? Do they have a business case? If you walk into a bank and want to secure a partnership between that bank and a livestock cooperative, for example, the big question would be that these organizations, the SMEs, the small and medium organizations, and by extension, the producer organizations are risky to invest in. That is what always comes in. So what Solidaridad does, we understand for sure that the risk is because they are not organized in most cases, or their liquidity levels are not stable. But what Solidaridad comes in to fill that gap and take the conversation a little bit further and secure partnerships with these banks, because we have done before, is that we use our development money to, one, capacity build the SMEs and the producer organizations, and ensure that they are sort of investment ready. So by doing that, we have already bridged the gap of actually what we do is de-risking. We work with private sector financial organizations to support them organize these farmers, to support them to develop sort of business plans to the producer organizations that when the bank looks at it, then they say this is investable. The groups also become more organized and more knowledgeable about managing finances. And the biggest thing that we do also to strengthen that kind of relationship is to support the producers to efficiently produce so that they are able to break even at production level, increase volumes, because business people can only invest money where there is a possible high return. So those are the set of activities that Solidaridad engage to de-risk the communities and small and medium enterprises.
That's really helpful. So I want to build on that. I want to ask Martin and Carolyn if you have some insight into what the mindset of companies and financial institutions might be around the arguments for landscape management as a de-risking strategy. So, because there's a lot of concern sort of globally for the risks from climate change, from water insecurity, for stranded agricultural assets, and those types of concerns. But I don't know how much does that really get into the thinking of individual investors when and can you make a compelling case that say, okay, if we look at this landscape as a whole, we can reduce some of those risks. So I just wonder if either of you have insights on it.
Let me make a comment on that. I think out of the programs that we've successfully been running with Solidaridad, we have noted very many partners coming in to partner with us in the landscape area, because as long as you say, example, that you want to reduce water use and to make sure that effluent water is not getting to our rivers, as long as you make a business case with partners out there that this cooperative would benefit from investment, example, in less water using technology, example, using ecopulpers, you make that kind of a business case and you get into a program that actually assists these farmers to get better technologies. If you get into a business case and say, look, over time we've noted that the soils have been, the fertility of the soils have been depleted owing to, inappropriate use of organic fertilizers. The question is, how do we make sure that farmers are doing soil analysis, et cetera, et cetera? You make a business case for that, and you end up with farmers around a region getting soils tested, investing in other things like better varieties, so that at the end of the day, the farmer can see a benefit by themselves, meaning even the cost of running, in our case, cooperatives, goes down so that in the end the savings can go back to the farmer and they're able to invest more. And the money is able to get, and so these kind of partners are ready to invest. And we've had many, to mention a few. We have had various partners coming in and helping. Currently, we have something with Toyota Kenya, somewhere in the Mount Kenya area, on the restoration of degraded forest areas around the coffee growing zones. We have done something with other partners like Hivos. We've done things with Nestle, IDH. We have done some work with Soil Cares, the Dutch government. Many partners coming in, as long as you can make a business case that this makes sense to invest in making sure that the environment and the landscape is protected. Then there are many organizations out there who are ready to invest. And the question also must be, for you as a private sector, what's in your investment also? And for us, we say, look, we train, we implement. So our focus is our time, our follow-up, so that our in-kind contribution is also seen with that. And therefore, the farmer invests in making sure that they're doing the right thing. The other partners help you, and the farmer ultimately benefits. And the cycle, and this kind of programs, you end up seeing it's more sustainable going forward. So yes, there is always, as long as you can build a case, ensure over time that there is a business case, yes, there are people ready to invest in it.
Carolyn, do you want to take it from the sort of more, sort of global financial institution side of things?
Sure. Well, as I said, I have ran a community of practice with 15 financial institutions in the Netherlands, banks, pension funds, impact investors, and this was on sustainability, on natural capital. Most of the financials in Europe are now working on climate change. Some of the financials in Europe are working on water risks of their investments. There are even financial institutions that are working on biodiversity. But if you talk landscapes, they think, why? I mean, we are already working on climate change, some maybe on water, so landscapes is not yet on their agenda. So when we came up with the idea to see whether we could start a community of practice in Africa for landscape approaches, we decided that it might be more clever to choose water as integrated water management as the way in to start the conversation with financial institutions. So an intern of mine did a study for her thesis for Erasmus University. She interviewed 15 financials working in Africa, impact investors, banks, a pension fund, and asked them about water, what they are seeing about doing about water, integrated water management, so water with a landscape approach. So no, they are not, the financials that I met are not really thinking about landscape approaches yet. It is already special if they think about water, but it is very high on the rise because of all the crises that we are seeing. So there are a lot of water risk tools for the financial sector now on the market. I always say, if you have your money invested in Heineken, for example, and Heineken has a production plant in an area where it's becoming drier and drier, then there is a risk that the local government will shut down the plant. It has happened to Nestlé in India, it has happened to Coca-Cola. So different multinationals have had problems with having to close plants because of drought. And if you're an investor and have your money invested in those kind of projects, you have a problem. So there is a rising awareness. And if you're interested in the study that my intern has done, I'm trying to get it on the website of the GLF. So there is a rising awareness that you have to move beyond carbon. It's not only about climate change, there are other issues. There's also an awareness that you have to look a bit broader and more holistic way to certain issues. But it's not that landscape is the first thing that is on their mind yet. So there is still work to be done. And we think that choosing water is the way to get a landscape approach on the agenda. And maybe you can, what we shared about your work on sustainability with the private sector, that you also see that the interesting thing about water is that it also makes connections with policies of government. Because you have to try to bring things together, not only focus on financials. They are, of course, heavily regulated, so they are heavily depending on government policy and policy of regulators. So you also need other actors to come on board. And, of course, water is something that is in many African countries high on the political agenda. So that's why we think this is the best way to go forward.
I think Caroline has said it really, and the last point that you made about the fact that water is something, not quoting you verbatim, but the essence being that there are many interests. If you look at, I'll give the example of water landscape in Botswana. We have something called the Okavango Delta. The Okavango Delta is dependent, and that delta services a variety of industries, cattle, wildlife, tourism, to name just a few. And the delta is dependent on water that comes from you know, originates from other countries like Angola, Namibia. So, you see, over and above the national, you now have regional issues. You have regional stakeholders in addition to the national, but we have to bring them together, to work out one strategies, have an integrated national and regional strategies for managing that resource. You also have to, there are so many interests from the investor side. So you see, what is important is to ensure that you coordinate these interests. You identify and define the different parameters of operation for each of the, these different players. If you don't do that, the investment become very, very wasteful, because they will one of the risks will be that there will be duplication. And this financial resources we so badly need for sustainable development, and we cannot afford not to optimize their utilization. So I thought I should just underline that point about getting the from the corporate side and also from the financial institutions, and also the global, including the global financing mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility and so forth. So there is need for coordinating and getting also the communities who are the direct beneficiaries of these landscapes, the ecosystems, the benefits that are flowing from these ecosystems, getting them on board so that, everybody understands and appreciates, the link between whatever they are doing and, and the agenda that you are putting before them. Thank you.
Louis?
Yeah.
Maybe to add, what might be of interest to people working in this kind of landscape initiatives, a lot of work usually goes into mapping national resources in a landscape, mapping the social situation and the governance situation in landscapes. But it's not always clear what financial institutions are connected to a landscape. And many times when initiatives are being worked out, people are at the end looking for investments, and a lot of times they are looking for investments from donors far away, whether it's the Norwegian government, the Dutch government, the Germans, maybe they have money to invest. But what might be of interest is that eco-agriculture together with the IUCN has developed a new tool, and it's called LIFT, the Landscape Investment Finance Tool. And it's a tool designed to find out who is making a return on the landscape. So what financial institution is making money because of activities within the landscape. Because it is, if you want to attract financials, you could not only think about, impact investors from far abroad, that might be a good resource to attract, but it's also interesting to find out what is the local financial situation? Because as the research of my interns showed, in many places, the local financial infrastructure is not really clear or not well known. So this tool can help people to get a better idea about what financial institutions are connected to landscapes. So if you then want to develop a more financial investment strategy, you can bring them aboard, which has different benefits. If you have local investors attracted to your initiative, it might be more easy to get other investors. And these kind of local investors can also help you to learn to speak the language of companies, because that is maybe something that you find out also. Not all NGOs or local policymakers are well trained in the language that you need for financials. So there could be multiple benefits to try to see whether you can work with your local bank, get your local bank involved. And LIFT might be helpful for that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Caroline. She did a great job of describing it. Liftkit.info is where you can find it. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Nancy, who we've had, like, as you can see, an incredible number of really intelligent questions come through on Slido. And so I think we'll start there, and Nancy will pose them to the panel as she's selected some and tried to group some together that are similar. And we'll get through as many of those as we can, and then if we run out of those for some reason, then we'll come to you to raise your hands. But if you, in the meantime, have another question and you want to get it in, you can add it to the list here by using Slido. And Nancy, take it away. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Looking at most questions, I think we have some good insights on that. But I'll start with the first highly voted questions. On the involvement of the community institutions. Peter, would you please explain to us, to the audience, on how we can get to involve communities better when we are having these investments in the landscapes? How does the Nduimet community get involved? How do you help prepare the landscape to be investment ready? Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy, for the question. I must say that the Nduimet community people, they are well prepared. First of all, accepting to create the area itself was one among the most important things that they actually did. Because to conserve this area, they have set up aside a portion of their land to be under the conservation area. So that is the most critical aspect of what they did. Secondly, these communities, they are ready to be capacitated, to be educated, especially on the issues to do on how to improve the value of their livestock products. And we are very appreciative to the support that we are getting from NGOs such as the Solidaridad. They have actually helped us a lot in terms of training our livestock cooperatives in the area. So to do that, it means the community are ready in terms of accepting the education side that comes from the other side of the participants, of the practitioners. And another thing is that they are all aware that without their engagement in the conservation efforts, more pressure is going to be on the land resources. And because they value more their livestock, so these people, they are ready to be part of the initiative that we are bringing to the area.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's clear that from the example, it all starts from the community helping to map out where the investments need to be taken. And I think Nduimet has clear land use plans on where the investors should be, on which should be the conservation areas. So the story can start from the community level. Thank you so much for that. I go to the next question on the role of political authorities. Desikala Sibata. Yes, I hope you are able to take up that question on what is the role of political authorities in the involvement of the private sector. How can we get the political authorities attract the private sector to the landscapes?
You know, the way this the political authorities get the private sector involved is through a process of national developing processes, national development planning. Well, traditionally, that process ideally should involve should be multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral, meaning that civil society, the communities, it must start from the grassroots the grassroots must identify their local needs, local priorities, and feed that into the, you know, the upper levels through their political representatives at the community level, right from the village development committees. And I'm talking an ideal situation. And then that must be consulted up to the, you know, up to the level where now the national priorities are identified. And once the priorities at that level, national level, have been identified, that they must be fed back to all the interested parties. And the private sector must always be there, and governments must ensure that the private sector is clear about the national development agenda. That is very, very important. And there are also issues around sustainability. The political leadership is always very crucial, and I know that we are not, we do not maximize, you know, we do not maximize utilization of the political leadership, but that is how ideally it should, and it has worked in some cases. So the political leadership must make the agenda clear to the private sector.
Okay.
And I know that in places, and I'm sorry that I keep referring to the Botswana examples. It's not the only example. There are also mechanisms or forums where there is high-level consultative dialogues and discussions between government and the private sector, and where the private sector is able to express their views on how they think, you know, development must be pursued. So I don't know if
I think that's a good answer. Let me see what Rono talks about our MSP approach in the landscapes, how you value the political authorities' role in bringing the private sector on board.
Yes, thank you, Nancy. I think I want to add that yes, number one is the first thing actually, before even we start to engage government has a bigger role to play in number one, developing policy, and number two, building the requisite infrastructure in the countries where we work. So with these two key obligations of government, then it is upon us, the actors, to interrogate if these policies are friendly, if there is requisite infrastructure. So if in cases where we find that there are inconsistencies, because that is usually what is there. There is a lot of disconnect in terms of policy. For example, you find the water policy and the agriculture policy do not agree in some aspects. So in such cases, therefore, and organizations like Solidaridad, which we pride ourselves to be a system actor, using our multi-stakeholder approaches, we convene dialogues to interrogate specific issues related to a specific landscape. For these purposes, if I talk about the Kilimanjaro landscape, so with these multi-stakeholder forums, our approach is actually to ensure that government is part and parcel of the dialogue, so that they are able to see. And when I say government, is the relevant departments in the landscape, to interrogate the policies, agree that there is a problem. And when we have agreed that there is a problem, that we set the process, the political process of how to address this problem. developing position papers, developing write-ups and building evidence to show that this does not work, and then push it through the political system. So we actually do not leave the government behind because they have a crucial role. And in terms of infrastructure, in specific landscapes, for example, there is some of these areas are extremely remote. So private sector may not be attracted to invest in areas where it's inaccessible, there is no electricity, there is no road, there is no telecommunications network. So all these are issues that are possible to discuss in a dialogue with government. Thank you.
Arono, could you just still give a rider on this question on if returns are so good where the companies involved not just doing it by themselves? I know that landscapes are bigger than what private sector needs, but I think this is something that you need to briefly just inform us on why we need the other actors here.
Yes. Martin explained about he's a private sector person and he has confessed that sustainability comes with brings returns to private companies, which is a fact. But why companies don't? I think that question you are asking because I said we support, like the NGOs, we use some development money to de-risk. So the question is that some, like I've explained in my last conversation, is that some areas have challenges which the private sector cannot address using their money. So we need additional support from some other areas. And some, the private sector may not do it alone because, like Nancy says, the landscape approach is a complex thing. So being complex, you will not find the private sector running there on their own to set up something. And that is why we create this platform, so that we are able to dialogue, discuss and address some of these issues. I think also the biggest problem why they are not there is that the level of awareness is still low. The landscape theory, the landscape philosophy, the landscape approach is a new thing, and most of the panelists have alluded to that, like the people in finance. When you talk about the landscape, some people say what? So what is it? So I think that is why people like Solidaridad come in to create awareness, build capacities, so that people are able to, and also the other thing is build evidence, show that it works. So like Martin said, it works. So in other landscapes, we also build evidence and show that it works, so that we attract these investments. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful, Rono. I think my question now goes to Martin. Martin, there's a question about farmer organizations and cooperatives being important vehicles for financial services and social inclusivity, and also ensuring sustainability. I know you work a lot with the cooperatives, but maybe you need to give more information on how you work with the cooperatives. But the second question is, how has the government ensured that you have a better environment to invest in landscapes? That's the enabling framework, yeah.
I think the second question is easier, so I'll start with the second question. Yes, the focus. In the Kenyan definition, at least in the context we work, a grower right now is a farmer cooperative, especially where you're dealing with smallholder farmers. So and these are the decision makers. So you need, first of all, to agree with the cooperative that, look, this is what we want us to partner with. They will call a meeting, a special general meeting, or during their annual membership meeting, annual general meeting, and this we will participate. We might involve other stakeholders in that discussion, and we bring the farmers up to speed. So at that cooperative level, when I heard about participation, then they are involved right from the word go, such that the community then understands. Then the management of the cooperative thereafter become your contact points. And our model is not just to work with the management committees of those associations, is also now to create a promoter farmer model, where now you now train others, other farmers who can be used on a day-to-day basis to help you disseminate this kind of information. And that way you are able to reach a lot more farmers and a lot faster and more efficiently. So yes, farmer organizations are critical because you will not succeed if you do not use them. Now, government. It is an enabler. They must create an enabling environment. The policies that government create must be stable, must be predictable, so that private sector can engage. Because if you change policy midstream, taxation policy or any other policy midstream, and you have already invested, then a private company like ourselves would be shy to participate in that kind of investment. But if you know that in the next 10 years this is a roadmap, then it is very easy, because then we know that the kind of funding or investment that we put, we are going to have it back in the next 10 years, and therefore more sustainable for us and for the community at large. So how government helps us is by creating an enabling environment that is stable and predictable.
Okay.
I would just like also to turn it upside down, because the experience I have with working with front-runner companies and investors is that these front-running companies or first-moving companies on all kinds of sustainable issues, if you bring them together in a platform or in a community, what government and politicians then see is that things can be done. So from front-runners and from first-mover companies and financial institutions, as government, you learn what is possible. To give an example, we had, as I said, a community of practice in the Netherlands on natural capital, and one of the things that came out of that community was a platform carbon accounting. So these are financial institutions that are developing methods to measure how much CO2 you emit with all your investments. So they were sharing, it's a bit like the GLF motto of, you know, connect, share, and act and stuff like that. So they shared their data, their methods of doing these kind of measurements. 2 years later, so that was last year, the European Commission, the DG FISMA, so the financial part of the European Commission, came out with a sustainable finance action plan. One of the parts of this finance action plan is about measuring carbon. And here there was a platform that already could give a method and a way to do this kind of measuring. So as governments, you can learn from frontrunners about what is possible to bring into regulation. So it's not only governments that help frontrunners, it's also, if you organize the frontrunners in a good way, the frontrunners can teach you as government or as politicians what is the way forward and what can be done. So there's a two-way relationship.
Okay, thank you so much, because it answers the question on what private sector needs, but also there was a question on what do private sector want from government. So I think that really takes care of that. But then there's this question on how do you mobilize the private sector in the financing of forest landscape restoration actions. I know, Van Linders, you talked about water, financing water, but forest restoration, a commodity that is a bit far from drawing money from it. So how can we mobilize private sector to do this restoration of forest landscapes, forested landscape?
Well, I think that many of us know that the relationship between forests and trees and water is very, very direct.
Yeah, sure.
I know that in many places where there are now water problems, like for example, the example of Cape Town, one of the reasons that the water ecosystems are drying up is because we have been chopping down trees. Because trees are the ones with their whole system that are keeping water ecosystems safe. So I think that once you start working on water, there are a number of sectors or issues, topics that you will hit almost directly. Agriculture, forestry, infrastructure, cities. So that's why I think it's an interesting way in, because it will bring you, depending on the landscape, of course, reforestation and trees will certainly come on your agenda as part of a strategy that you have to develop if you want the ecosystem service of clean water staying. So.
Well, I think that's amazing. It depends on the type of services that ecosystem brings on board. But then I want to take, how am I doing on time? How many more questions can I take? Two? Okay, just 2 questions. Ronald, there is a question on gender equality.
Yes.
And I did not want to ask Van Linda because most people think gender is a women issue, and I want this question to be answered by a man. So, yes, how can gender equality be ensured in such investments with the belief that women have a weaker starting point, less access to education, finance, land, and decision making, but also on the basis that we are working with the Ma community in the Kilimanjaro landscape where these issues are real. So how do you get to involve women? How do you ensure that there is equity and equality in the investments or in what you're doing?
Okay, thank you. I think the idea of gender equity and equality is an idea that has come at the right time. It is an idea that whose time has come, and actually it's something that forms part and parcel of Solidaridad work. Actually, we have a global strategy on gender, and all our programs, we strive to make them inclusive. Inclusive in the sense of women, in the sense of youth who are also left behind. As you may be aware that in the East African region, statistics show that our farmers are aging, and we say between 50 and 60 years. That is the average age of producers in the region. So that shows also that there is a big problem with youth not being involved in agriculture or agribusiness. So to go to the example of the Kilimanjaro and the West Kilimanjaro specifically, where the Ma community is, the scenario becomes a bit more complex because these are women largely illiterate, largely isolated because of, they don't own land, they don't own cows, and they are excluded from leadership positions. So what we do as Solidaridad is that through our capacity building approaches, we support the SMEs, the producer organizations, to understand that when women are involved, actually there is a possibility that they are more productive, and capacity building them on rights, capacity building them on alternative livelihoods. They may not do livestock production, but they can do businesses related to livestock production, like milk trade. They can do other diversified activities which are landscape focused, like beekeeping, which is highly profitable. And in terms of because women are known to utilize the forests in terms of firewood, we also bring on board alternative energy using technologies to women, because that also saves them time to go out there looking for these resources, so that they can spend more time in doing something else. Other innovations like the kitchen gardens, so that they are able to also get food ready, which are very nutritious, and able to make their families productive. There are other innovations also like financing, the women local, the village financing, the merry-go-rounds, and linking them to creating those ones to be a little bit more organized so that they are able to do some businesses with them is also something we do. But the most critical thing that Solidaridad does is in building capacities for these women and actually the community to accept that women can lead. And I can give an example of Enduimet, who is our implementing partner, that in their board we have ensured that through these conversations, there are women represented in the board. In the cooperatives also, we have, through these discussions and capacity building, ensured that there are women representatives in the leadership of the livestock cooperatives and the forest management committees and water management committees in that landscape. So it's a challenge, but step by step, using our methodologies, we are able to address. I just want to finish by saying that the Solidaridad, we use the household approach to address this gender issue, because we don't want to get women out there, and so we take care of the whole household. In terms of investments, like I said, we also have ensured that these activities that women do, they not only do it at subsistence scale, but we support them to grow the businesses, the livelihoods into businesses, so that they are able to earn a little bit more money and become more independent and are able to survive in the more or less patriarchal society. Thank you.
That's fine. Allow me to come to the end of our question and answer session. I know that from the discussions we've had, Rono has talked about inclusion of the youths, because we have a very big question on inclusion of youths here, but I hope it is kind of answered, but we can never be conclusive on how we can get to invest in the youths. But youths have to be investment ready. I think that's the word someone has answered, develop the business plans and everything. But also the question of technologies, as Rono has said, biodigestion has been asked, but I think we've said we are investing in technologies also in landscapes in order to maintain the landscapes. But I think also from the discussions, there is a question on how do we transform culture. But I think continuously we are seeing that engagement through these multi-stakeholder approaches, capacity building sessions, are seeing even the Maasai changing their culture to believe that they need to produce more with less, have more milk with less cows. So this is a discussion that is going on, and I think it's something that is already happening. I believe that from what we received in on slido.com, we've been able to take care of all your questions, and allow me to return the session to Louise. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Nancy, and thank you all for those for excellent questions, and to the panelists for excellent responses. And I just want to extend an invitation to anyone in the room who wants to continue to engage on these issues with the excellent members of the Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature Initiative who are represented up here, and also all of the other members, member organizations who are working on business engagement and advancing finance for integrated landscape management. Membership in the Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature Initiative is free and voluntary, and we as a secretariat do our best to make sure that you get out more than you put in. So if you're interested in that, it's peoplefoodandnature.org, and the contact and all of that is on there. And we continue to advance the African Landscapes Action Plan, and these issues in particular in that regard regionally. And there's dialogue that continues on that. And what we really focus on when we do that is getting groups like Solidaridad, Coffee Management Services, Endemit, Wildlife Management Area, together, who are really working on the ground to share experience about what's working and how they're engaging people, so that the conversation goes from the high level that we sometimes have in these larger meetings down to where it's really practical and people can learn from each other's experiences. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to look into the LPFN and what we've been about over the last 4 years and what we continue to be about. So thank you all for coming, and I think it's coffee break time, and we've ended right on time, and I'm just going to let you loose. Thanks.